Okay, welcome everyone to Site 1100. My name is David Simpson. I'll be your instructor for this course. This is my first week teaching at Douglas College. I finished my PhD at the University of Alberta this year, although I've been teaching intro psych material for a long time. This week is a little special for me because I actually did my undergrad in psychology right here at Douglas College. And I have had various experiences that have convinced me that the education you'll get here is better than what you'll get at the big universities. So I spent several years working with undergraduates at the University of Alberta. Most of the instructors that you'll have at a place like UBC or SFU don't care very much about teaching. They have a publish or perish mindset. They are primarily focused on research. At a place like Douglas, the instructors here actually care about teaching, so don't sell Douglas short. You can get a fine psychology education here. Now, show of hands, how many of you are planning on being on psych majors? Usually it's a minority. So obviously it's a very popular elective as well. How many of you, this is your first psychology class that you've ever taken? So presumably most. You can take 1200 first, but 1100 then 1200 is the more normal way of doing things. Have any of you taken 1200? Just 2 or 3, okay. Have any of you taken a psych course in high school? Sometimes a few, yeah, so a few done that. So as I say, I did my undergrad here at Douglas College. I took my first psych class just a little over 10 years ago. I came in knowing nothing about psychology. I knew who Freud was. How many of you know who Freud is? So that was all I knew coming in. But I fell in love with it and decided to major in it. I came in with an interest in philosophy, started off interested in philosophy. And after finishing my bachelor's degree, I decided to give philosophy one more chance. So I did my master's degree in philosophy in the United States at Georgia State University. And then for various reasons, I switched back to psychology and did my PhD at the University of Alberta. So one housekeeping thing I forgot. Show of hands, who's on the wait list? Only one. So just come and speak to me after and just tell me your name. I don't have control of the wait list until the beginning of next week. For now, just do the normal, try to get in thing. But I have the ability to let in a few people, and if you came to class, I'll give you more consideration. So I'm going to start with some general comments about psychology. So most of you don't know very much about psychology. The subject matter of psychology is you all. Psychology is the scientific study of the human mind and human behavior. So you will see connections between the material you learn and yourself, and you should reflect on those connections. It will make the material more interesting, and it will also make it easier to remember. This puts us in an enviable position in psychology because we get to study something interesting. To fulfill a lab requirement in my undergrad, I took a course on geology. Geology applies the scientific method to rocks. So not very interesting, at least for most people. For my prof, it was very interesting. He was uncomfortably interested in rocks. He showed us a picture of mudstone once and stared at it for an uncomfortably long period of time and then said, "Isn't it beautiful?" So at least he was excited about it, but we are in a better position. We study human beings, which, as far as I'm concerned, that's much more interesting. So I'll give a kind of sampling of the kinds of topics we'll be talking about. This is not necessarily in the order that we'll cover them, but things like, are human differences in personality due to genetics or to the environment? So how many of you have heard of like the nature-nurture debate? So a few of you, so we'll be talking about that. There is a chapter on the brain. This will be more fun for some of you than for others, but to understand psychology, it's very important to understand how the brain works. Things like what happens when different parts of the brain are damaged. We'll be talking about human development, especially development in childhood. We'll be talking about how the senses work, vision, hearing, etc. We'll be talking about how memory works and different strategies for improving it, why we have dreams, and the effects of different drugs, both legal and illegal. Now, before we get to some of those more fun topics, we do have to do some background, including a chapter on research methods and statistics, although nothing too fancy there. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. So we're going to spend a good chunk of today talking about Blackboard and the syllabus. How many of you, this is your first semester here? Oh, more than, okay, so maybe 30, 40%. Okay, well, that loads. So most important online resources, Blackboard. It has the syllabus and various other resources. So I'll come back to this later. So course questions. This is where you should ask questions that pertain to everyone. So rather than me answering what an independent variable is in 10 different emails, just ask it here. It's public. I'll get a notification and try to reply promptly. Okay. Okay, back to life. And then if it pertains just to you, obviously, send me an email. Now I'll come back to the syllabus. We'll actually go through the whole syllabus just so everything is clear. But the most important document is this one, the key terms list. This document should be your best friend. So based on the way I teach this course, you should be focused on learning these terms. Something happened and we couldn't add a feature. Thanks for that. Okay, so you should have this open in class. Take notes as we go through it, and as we come closer to the various tests, you should test yourself on these key terms. They're typically not especially complicated, but there's a large number of them. That's kind of the name of the game. Psychology, especially at the intro level, is kind of a memorization game, so this is designed to help you succeed. I will say this, the vast majority of the questions on the test will relate in some way to these terms. I can't guarantee for sure that every single question will, but if you know all of these, you'll be just fine. I have here a PowerPoint with study notes. You can follow along in class if you want, or you can just use it to study. I don't use PowerPoint when I teach. I think that the temptation to just read off the slides is too great, so I use the whiteboard. But some people feel like they just need PowerPoint, so that's available if you want to use that to follow along. It should correspond roughly to the order in which I teach, so you can use it to follow along or to study later. It will not cover all testable ideas, but you know the big ideas will all be in there. Don't worry too much right now about the APA assignment. I'll be devoting about 30-40 minutes at the beginning of a future class to explaining that. I'll just say, I'll make it a challenge. Just keep this challenge in mind. When I taught Intro Psych at the University of Alberta, the class average on this assignment was around 8 out of 10. I challenge you all to beat that. As far as I'm concerned, the average should be 9.5 to 10. There's really no reason for it to be 8. All you have to do is download this template and edit it to turn it into your own. Keep the formatting, etc. the same. Most of the marks come from following APA style, which if you do what the template says, you'll get 10 out of 10. The only thing, I'll just quickly show you what it looks like. The only way you can lose marks is if you are creative. I strongly discourage creativity. Just do what the template says and you'll be fine. As I say, I'll come back to that in a future class. I think after test 2. This link here is an opportunity to get bonus marks. I can't guarantee, there's always one. I can't guarantee that there will be enough there for everyone to get the bonus marks. This is, you will do an online survey or come to an in-class or in-person experiment. So keep an eye on that if you want bonus marks. Any questions on Blackboard before we open the syllabus?
Oh, your syllabus has the wrong number. I was looking for it for like 20 minutes.
Ah, that sounds like something I would do.
It has like a non-existent number.
Yeah, that's not good. No, it should be right.
Oh, it's your office.
Yeah, that's my office.
I'm so dumb.
So that room does exist, but it's too small to have a class.
Yeah, it's
so.
kind of impossible to find,
Yeah.
right?
So anyways, yeah, so hey, good clarification. So there's 2 rooms listed here. This is where we meet, this is here, and this is my office, which is sort of 3rd floor down at the end of the hall in the psych department. So while we're on the subject of office hours, times are listed here. That's where you can come see me one-on-one if you want to ask questions. No appointment required if you come to those times. I'll always be there. If neither of those times work for you, send me an email. We'll figure something out. Some instructors are sticklers about names. I don't care. You can call me David or Dr. Simpson. Doesn't matter to me. What you call me just doesn't really matter. One day I'm gonna die. Within a few generations, no one will remember me. It doesn't really matter. Show of hands. Who remembers the name of any of their great-great-grandparents? That's how long it takes. We don't actually matter that much. So, anyways. Okay, so questions. Okay, we're gonna strike a bargain as a class. My end of the bargain is I'm going to do my best to respond to all emails within 24 hours. I have notifications on my phone. My default is just to reply quickly and succinctly. Don't be freaked out if I reply really quickly. It's just my way of not letting them pile up. So that's my end of it. On your end, please follow these guidelines. Number 1, check the syllabus before sending an email. Just use Control F. I've tried to answer the obvious questions in the syllabus. And as I already said, if your question pertains to everyone, so anything about course content or the tests or anything like that, put it in course questions. I'll get a notification and reply. And then of course, if you have a question that pertains to you, then yes, just use the email listed here. I'd rather you not use Blackboard Messenger, just send an email to that address. And lastly, I strongly encourage in-class questions. You all will have questions about this material. It's about human beings and human behavior. So if there's a point of interest that you want to know more about, please ask in-class questions. That will keep it more interesting. I will note, I may have to stop questions because we have limited time. So if I feel we have to finish a chapter on a certain day, I may say no more questions, but if I do that, that means I'm very happy. That means there was a lot of engagement. But for practical reasons, I may have to cut things off. Okay, the textbook's available in the bookstore, loose leaf, so it's cheaper than it otherwise would be. I'm going to add a code for the course. There's a specific code to access the online version. You still have to pay for that. Personally, I'm old-fashioned. I like a physical book, but for those of you who prefer online, I'll be adding the code. If you pay for the online code, you can access it in conjunction with what I'll add later. Oh, and sorry, on that subject, people often ask, how important is it to get the textbook? Is it required? Here's what I'll say. Technically, I'm going to say it's required. I can't guarantee that every question on the test will be covered in class, but in my past student reviews, students have told me they felt they didn't need it to do well. They felt that the vast majority of the content was covered in lecture. You're all adults, you can do with that information what you will. Certainly you'll be able to do quite well. You may not get every single last question, but with the material and lecture, you'll certainly be able to do well. You just might not quite get that A+. Okay, so as I already mentioned, I don't use PowerPoint when I teach. I use the whiteboard and video clips and maybe the occasional picture. This should be obvious, but sometimes you have to say obvious things anyways. If I show a video clip of someone, that doesn't mean I endorse every single thing they have ever said. So I'll have that caveat. As you can all see, this lecture is being filmed, which is good because I had another 1100 class earlier in the week when the evacuation happened. How many of you were here for the evacuation? So a few of you, so missed that. Normally that class will be the guinea pig, so I'll practice with them and then can fix up whatever I messed up for this class. So the lecture will be filmed and put on YouTube. If you sit up front here, the back of your head may be on YouTube. So this allows you to rewatch a lecture for studying or for other reasons. The only thing that will not be included in the video is the clips I show. I edit those out because otherwise YouTube removes them for copyright infringement. Yes, I already mentioned the study notes and the PowerPoint notes that you can use. Here are some optional video resources. So these aren't testable, but Hank Green's Crash Course Psychology. I'm sure many of you have used Crash Course. It's a great resource. And if you have no life, Paul Bloom's Intro Psychology lectures from Yale. Okay, so here's the schedule of the stuff we'll be covering. So this semester will start to move pretty quickly. So I spread the tests out. So there's 4 tests, one of which is a cumulative final. And the first one is not that far off. It's not next week, but the week after. But this means that none of them are worth too much, as we'll see later when I show you the breakdown. So the first test, January 23rd, will be on chapters 1 and 2. I've added extra days. These are optional, so each Friday, before a test, I've booked N2201. That's the room across from the library, that's a bigger room. So you can come to that day if you have any outstanding questions that you'd like to ask in person. If you can't make it, it's okay. It will also be filmed and put on YouTube. That's all that matters. Oh, and then yes, for April 10th, we'll be going to the psych lab. The room should be listed here. Yep, so this is the psych lab. So we'll meet there, and we'll get to dissect sheep brains. And you should all feel very lucky. You are one of the well, I see some people who don't look like they feel very lucky, but I got to do this when I did my undergrad here, actually twice. You are one of the last classes that will be able to do this. The psych department is moving to another building, and for various boring bureaucratic reasons, we will no longer have access to the sheep brains. So some of you are looking forward to this, some of you are not. How many of you are very sad that you're in this class? Okay. For study tips, one I've already mentioned in passing. You should test yourself, especially on the key terms. So there's studies showing that testing yourself on material is a more effective way of getting them into long-term memory than just rereading it. Rereading can lull you into a false sense of security. You feel like you understand it when maybe you don't. So the way I did this in undergrad, I have 2 lists, one my notes on terms and the other with just the terms. I'd go into a room where no one could hear me so I don't seem like a lunatic and just, go through the different terms. Parental investment theory, that is blah, 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 blah. Operational definition, that, I don't remember, X, right? So go through, so you'll do 2 things. First of all, as I said, you'll strengthen your memory of the material you've learned, but you'll also find out what you don't know, which of course is useful. And if you come to a point where you can go through all the terms successfully using that process, you're most of the way done. Like you're basically ready for the test. Number 2, categorize the information into chunks. If you organize it in that way, it will make it easier to remember. There's research to back that up as well. Number 3, this one I took from my supervisor, David Prime. He's also teaching 1100 this semester. I did an honors thesis here at Douglas, and he was my supervisor. Very bad joke we refer to as David squared. But anyways, he would always say this. Don't focus on memorizing the ideas, focus on understanding them. Try to make connections between the material and other things you know, or to yourself. Try to think about it deeply. If you do that, the memorization will come along for free. Just repeating it to yourself, not as effective. And lastly, expose yourself to the ideas multiple times and in multiple ways. If you're struggling, you may need to hear someone else say it differently. That's why I provided the optional extra video resources and the PowerPoint notes. So you have multiple things. You have the lecture, you can rewatch it on YouTube, you have the book. So if you didn't quite get something, maybe hearing it a second time and in a second way may help. Okay, here's the grades. That's standard, should be the same everywhere. Okay, something is underlined, so I'm going to say this emphatically. There will be no changes to student grades based on requests at the end of the semester. So if you're 0.6% away from the A- and you write me a very sad email saying, oh, Dr. Simpson, I got a B+, and if my mom finds out I didn't get an A-, she won't love me anymore, and can you please save my relationship with my mother, whatever you say. In my opinion, it's not fair for you to get a better grade because you're good at writing a sad email. So just up front, just starting now, try to do your best and let the chips fall where they may. Now, if you have questions about your grade on a specific assignment or something and think you deserved more, that's fine. You can email me about that throughout the semester and I can explain why you got what you got and maybe change it. But if you just say, I want to get this grade that I'm so close to, please be sorry for me and change it, you are wasting your time typing said email. One thing I'll add, because first year students, including younger me, sometimes freak out about little differences like that. It's easy to forget that you're gonna have to do 40 courses to get a bachelor's degree and how little those differences matter. And little exercise, you can use this GPA calculator. Just click on the link, enter 40 random grades, and change one of them from a B+ to an A- or whatever. It won't make any difference. It doesn't matter. So, as I say, just do your best and let the chips fall where they may. Okay, here's the breakdown. Ooh, forgot about the attendance quiz. I was going to do that earlier. So, attendance quizzes. So there's an attendance quiz every day. This is to provide some incentive to show up. The quizzes are not hard. I will literally just say, select option 7, and you will get full marks for that. So, we're actually just going to do the first one right now. So open up Blackboard. So normally, today I had to do some background first, but normally this will be at the beginning of class, so it's also an incentive to show up on time. But here's a caveat I'll add. Things happen, people get sick of hearing me talk, whatever the reason may be. If you can't make it to class for any reason, type up a 300-word, which is just one page, double space, not very much, summary of some interesting things you learned from the chapter. It does not have to be brilliantly written. I'm not going to be marking it in a super picky way. As long as it looks like a basically good faith attempt, you'll get full marks. So just send it to me before class begins, and then you'll get the mark for that attendance check. and even with everything considered, each one is only 0.5% for and then 10 classes, so 5% total. Yes. Refresh a couple times. Okay, so what's your name? Alan. Okay, so just send me an email with your name, so I'll remember, and then I'll just, as a reminder, and then I'll, yep. Show of hands who has this issue. Okay, so all of you send me an email at the end of class just saying, hey, I'm so-and-so, I was one of the people with the issue, and I can just override it. Okay, here's the breakdown of the tests. So the tests will, except for the cumulative final has some other stuff, but they will each have 20 multiple choice questions per chapter. The first 2 tests each have 2 chapters, so 40 multiple choice, and then 1 written question. The written question, I will basically tell you what it is in advance. So you should come fully ready to answer that. The APA assignment, as I say, we'll talk about that more at a later date. Tests 3 and 4 have no written. Test 3 is on more chapters, so it's 60 multiple choice, so 3 chapters. Test 4 is a cumulative final, but a bigger chunk of it is the final 2 chapters because you only get tested on them once, so that kind of evens that out. So 40 come from the last 2 chapters, and then 30 come from all of the prior chapters. And then as I mentioned, there's a brain dissection day. So you do get graded for that, not by me, but by the lab people, and that's another 5% of your grade. Okay, each test is during normal class time, except for test 4. That one's during finals week. You will have 2 hours and 50 minutes to finish each test. That should be much more than you need. So at the U of A, these tests, you only had an hour and 20 minutes to finish. That's what they're designed for. This is nice because some students need accommodations for various reasons. This should take care of most of them. This is much more time than you should need. So most accommodations requests can be taken care of just with that. Please bring a pencil and your student ID to each test. Pencil for the Scantron and ID for when you hand it in. My favorite, one of my classes at the U of A thought I was a lunatic. I broke down in tears laughing when one student handed in their test. I was just in just the right mood for it. So I said, student ID, please. Shows me his pencil. I was like, okay, well. And then he tried again, and he had it like backwards, like the side without the picture. I think he was just really stressed, but it was like multiple failed efforts to show me his ID. But I believe in you all. You can do better. Okay, as I say, we'll talk about this stuff later. For the bonus, you can get up to 3% bonus if you participate in studies, but I can't guarantee there will be enough for everyone. Okay, missed tests. Here's my policy with regard to this. If you give me lots of notice about some kind of scheduling conflict, I'm not going to be strict about requiring documentation. So have a look at the schedule later today or later this week, and see if there are any conflicts. If it's with a normal class, that's easy. Just send me the 300-word summary of the chapter. But if there's a scheduling conflict with the test, send me an email. And if you send it to me now, I'll basically just take your word for it. Probably what I'll try to get you to do is write it with my other 1100 class. If that doesn't work either, like if you're away for a whole week, you'll probably wind up writing it in my office like when you get back. However, if you email me a day or two before the test kind of thing, then I will be strict about documentation. Doctor's note, some other kind of verification. So just saying, oh, I don't feel so well, can I do it next week? That alone will not be sufficient. Use common sense. There's another prof in the department, Brian Nadeau, and if you know the name Brian Nadeau, I don't know if he's teaching another class this semester, but he went on a spiel similar to the one I just went on, and he said that around midterms, grandmas drop like flies, if you see what he means. Yeah. Around midterms, just everyone's grandma coincidentally dies. And so one year he said, look, I hate to be strict, but I do need some kind of documentation. And one student decided to send the ashes of their grandmother as verification. So please don't do anything like that. I think the funniest example I have was one student said they had a severely injured foot and couldn't make it to class and sent me a picture of the foot. So, anyways. Okay, last thing, and this one, there's a very specific reason for this. I got the following complaint from Reddit when I was teaching at the U of A. So, I was once an 18-year-old male. I'm not judging, right? We are all mammals. This is just a friendly reminder with no judgment to do the normal things. This is a small classroom, so shower, use deodorant, all that good stuff. And I have a note at the bottom. If you are thinking, no man, my natural scent is pleasant, you probably need to shower more than anyone. Okay, any questions on the syllabus? Okay, so we still have a decent amount of material to cover today. My goal is to give a kind of preamble about psychology and then get into the first chapter and hopefully finish the first chapter today. At some point in the middle of the class, I will give you all a break. We still do have a lot to cover today. I'll start with the absolute basics. What is psychology? So psychology comes from two root words, psyche and logos. Psyche means mind or soul. And logos, strictly speaking, means word, but it can also mean discourse about or study of. So psychology is the scientific study of the human mind and human behavior. Scientific study of the human mind and human behavior. So crucially, we at least try to be scientific. A related word is empirical. Empirical means based on observation. Meaning not just based on thinking about stuff, you have to go out in the world and look, do measurements, experiments, etc. The kinds of things that are detectable by the five senses. This makes psychology different from philosophy. Now, there's nothing wrong with philosophy. I did my master's in philosophy, but it's a different kind of inquiry. Philosophers ask many similar questions. They ask questions about the human mind, for example, but they don't typically do experiments. Philosophers just argue about things. They put forward conceptual arguments for different conclusions. Whereas in psychology, as I say, we have to test things empirically. Psychology, I should say, is also different from sociology. Sociology is also an empirical study or an empirical discipline that looks at human behavior, but sociology looks at human behavior from the group perspective or a group level of analysis. Whereas psychology is interested in the individual level of analysis. So let me make that concrete. Take racism as something to study. Psychologists will still get groups of people into the lab, but they're interested in things like, what do people believe, or what emotions do people feel about other groups? So it's at the individual level of analysis. A sociologist would study racism as a societal or structural kind of process. So that's an example that should make the distinction clear. Additionally, it's useful to know how scientists standardly think about psychology in relationship to the other sciences. In the standard scientific picture of the world, it is thought that psychology reduces to biology, which in turn reduces to chemistry, which in turn reduces to physics. What do I mean by that? So I already said that psychology is the study of human thinking and behaving, right? The human mind and human behavior. What is it that enables us to think and behave in the ways that we do? Well, says the psychologist, it's the 3 pounds of meat between your ears. It's the brain. At least that's what does the lion's share of the work. Other parts of the body contribute in certain ways too. For example, I guess this is in 1200, but there's a chapter on emotions that talks about different ways that different bodily states are relevant. But in any case, all of these processes are studyable by biologists. Psychology is, in a certain sense, just zoomed out biology. It's too hard to study what every neuron is doing. So we use more coarse-grained concepts like thinking, believing, etc. And then what about biology? So take the study of the brain, which is, strictly speaking, a biological area of study. Well, the brain is really just complicated chemistry, as we will see in a future chapter. It's sodium and potassium moving through voltage gates. There's no wonder tissue. It's all chemical reactions that we understand. And then what's chemistry? Well, really, it's just complicated physics. It's just particles obeying the laws of physics. But again, it's too hard to write Schrodinger's equation for every chemical reaction, so chemistry is more zoomed out. So that's standardly how psychology is thought to relate to the other sciences. Now, why do we need a science of the mind? You know, we all have intuitions and traditions about, how people think. All of you have opinions about psychology that you've formed throughout your life. Why can't we just trust that? Several reasons, but one reason is human beings are not as smart as we think we are. The scientific method, in part, grows out of an awareness of human limitations. It's worth remembering, we are genetically more closely related to chimpanzees than Asian elephants are to African elephants. It's impressive that we've gotten as far as we have, but it's not a good idea to just trust our instincts or intuitions. We are very fallible. One particular type of human fallibility is confirmation bias. How many of you have heard the phrase confirmation bias? So maybe 5 or 6. So confirmation bias is the tendency to seek or interpret evidence in a way that favors the beliefs you already have. Basically, trying to prove yourself right. If you have to go looking for evidence, you will seek out evidence that confirms what you already think. And if you're given pieces of evidence, you will interpret it in a way that confirms what you already think. You know, if you're given two studies, one that supports your belief and one that goes against it, the one that supports your belief, you'll just take it at face value. Yep, great study, very well done. One that goes against your belief, you'll go looking for problems, and usually you'll be able to find them. Let's see if this looks okay on the... I'm not sure I want to pull the thing down for every picture. That's going to be annoying. So yes, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. Time to do my own research on the real truth. Literally the first link that agrees with whatever you already believe. Jackpot. So that's a well-established human bias. While I wait for that to order, one way that science corrects this is by putting forward theories that are falsifiable. Falsifiable means able to be proven wrong. If a theory is unscientific or unfalsifiable, that means nothing could prove it wrong. And that might sound good, like, yeah, it's unfalsifiable. It's like an indestructible idea that nothing can disprove. But that is actually bad. So we don't want ideas that are unfalsifiable. We want, in science, to have theories that kind of stick their neck out. Ideas that lead to predictions that you can test. So here's an example that you don't need to know in any detail. This is not a physics class, but take Einstein's theory of relativity. One of the consequences of that theory is that gravity can curve the fabric of space. And so, which is a very bold claim, but one thing that follows from that is that light can be curved when moving past a massive object. So let's say here's the sun, here's the earth, not to scale obviously. Starlight moving past the sun should be curved by the sun's gravity. Normally, you can't observe the stars near the sun because it's too bright out. But you can during a solar eclipse. So some of you may know that Einstein's theory was put to the test when there was an eclipse, after he had put forward his theory. And what the theory predicts is the starlight should appear here rather than here where it quote, should be. Point at the telescope. Now, this is a falsifiable theory. If the starlight is not here, the theory is wrong. So that's good. That's an example of falsifiable theory that, as we say, sticks its neck out. Some theories in psychology, including one we'll talk about later today, arguably are not falsifiable, and therefore their scientific status is questionable. There's a clip I used to show. The audio is kind of bad, but you can look it up on the internet. It's a clip of Richard Feynman. How many of you saw Oppenheimer? Oh, not very many. So Feynman was a scientist who worked in the Manhattan Project. He has a minor role in the movie. He's giving a lecture and he says, this is basically all science is. Step one, you make a guess, which is basically a simple way of saying hypothesis. You just take a guess. You compute what follows from the guess. So if this guess is right, what should I observe? You compare the consequences of the guess to observation. And if the observation disagrees with the guess is wrong. That's basically it. So that's why falsifiability is important. Okay, I've gone through a few different terms. Any questions about anything I've said so far? A few more distinctions we have to draw. One important one is the difference between basic and applied research. So basic research, actually I'm going to do applied first, that'll be easier. So applied research is done for a specific practical reason. So let's say I test out 2 different teaching methods to see which one leads to better grades for my students. That would be applied research. There's an obvious practical benefit to finding out which teaching method is better. If I test out different forms of medication to see which one is more effective at treating the symptoms of schizophrenia, again, straightforward, practical case. Those would all fall under applied research. If you're doing basic research, you don't really care about helping people. You just want to figure out how the mind works. So there are different theories of, about, I don't know, like visual processing, different theories of how emotions work. My own area is moral psychology, which might sound like it's applied, but it really isn't. Most researchers in moral psychology are simply interested in how humans think about moral problems. What practical benefit does it have? Maybe down the road it'll have them, but people who do basic research just want to find out how things work. And you might wonder, well, why bother doing basic research? And to answer that question better than me, I have a video of a physicist on a kind of comedy show, but he makes a very good case for why it's important to let science engage. He doesn't use the term basic research, but it's basically what he's talking about. Okay, another way of carving up the tasks of science is to carve it into 4 different kinds of activity. This maps somewhat onto the basic versus applied distinction, although don't worry too much about that. For our description, actually make sure I get the order right. Explanation, prediction, and influence or control. So the first kind of activity is description. So let's take depression as a subject that psychologists study. Description, you're just trying to figure out what's going on, what the kind of empirical facts are. So what percentage of the population has depression? Is there a sex difference in the rate of depression? Are there differences in depression between countries or whatever? Just the basic facts. What are the facts? If description is about what are the facts, you could say explanation is why are the facts. Kind of a strangely constructed sentence, but you're trying to figure out why the facts are what they are. So why does depression emerge? So you could ask a question like, are there differences in neurotransmitter levels between depressed and non-depressed people? Is there a genetic basis to depression? Or is it more a result of the environment and early experience? All of that would fall in the explanation bucket. Prediction we've already talked about. If your theory about depression is any good, it should enable you to make testable predictions. So we already saw why that's so important in science. The ability to make predictions is what makes a theory falsifiable. And then lastly, influence and control. If your theory is any good, it should have some kind of practical result. So we talked about the basic versus applied distinction. Early on when you're doing basic research, there may not immediately be practical benefits, but when there are, that does increase your confidence that the theory is onto something. Why do we trust the physicists so much? Well, their theories enable us to send rockets to space, to build planes and new iPhones. All of that is because those technologies only work because the theories in physics are true or approximately true. So if the theory is any good, it should enable you to have some kind of practical effect. So in the case of depression, if we have a good understanding of depression, it should, at least eventually, enable us to treat it better. As an example. We're going to do a little activity. We're going to focus on prediction. There's something called hindsight bias, sometimes called the "I knew it all along" phenomenon. The hindsight bias refers to the fact that once you already know something, it's easy to tell yourself, "Oh, that's obvious," or "I already knew that." What's much harder is to predict it in advance. So we'll do a little activity. We'll see how well you all do. Hopefully this gives you some real experience with this. I have on my file 6 statements about psychology that have been tested. And I have here whether they are true or false to the best of our knowledge, keeping in mind, of course, that science is provisional. But based on the best psychological science, I have here whether they are true or false. I'm going to read the 6 statements, and I want you to guess which of them are true and which of them are false. So, number 1, opposites attract. In the context of romantic attraction. So people who have opposite traits are more attracted to each other. So write down true or false. Number 2, aggression releases anger. So for example, if you're angry and you punch a punching bag, it kind of lets it out. You're less angry after. Number 3, nicer people make less money. Number 4, IQ scores have gone up in the last 100 years. Number 5, the more you see something, the more you dislike it. Number 6, adopted siblings, so siblings who are adopted into the same family from different biological parents, are somewhat similar in their personality. Okay, has everyone got their guess for each of the 6? Okay, opposites attract. Show of hands who thinks it's true. Okay, who thinks it's false? Okay, good, so majority, it is false, so most of you got it. So based on the best research we have, in fact, the opposite is true. The more things you have in common with someone, the more attracted you are to them. Except for genetic relatedness, obviously. That's the big exception. We'll talk about that in the F side chapter. Number 2, aggression releases anger. Show of hands who thinks it's true. Who thinks it's false? Okay, this one is also false. In the studies that have been done, you punch a punching bag, you get more angry, as far as the studies show. Number 3, nicer people make less money. Who thinks it's true? Who thinks it's false? This one is actually true. Life is unfair. Now, of course, just on average, but that's a well-replicated finding. IQ scores have gone up in the last 100 years. Who thinks it's true? Who thinks it's false? This one is true. Pretty substantially, about 30 points. So very non-trivially. We talk about that in 1200, not 1100. The more you see something, the more you dislike it. There's a saying that familiarity breeds contempt. Who thinks it's true? Who thinks it's false? So this one is false. There's something called the mere exposure effect. I don't know if it's in 1100, but the more you see something, the more you like it on average. Okay, last one, adopted siblings are similar in their personality. Who thinks it's true? Who thinks it's false? So some people are not sure, that's fine. So this one is false. At least once they grow up, adopted siblings are about as similar as strangers in most things that you can measure. In the nature-nurture chapter, we'll be seeing this in more detail. Most people have the intuition that most human traits are, partly nature, partly nurture. That's true. But the environment bit does not seem to have much to do with the family environment. There's a large body of evidence that the family environment has a pretty limited effect on psychological traits that we can measure. There are exceptions, but we get into that more in the, I guess that's chapter, well, actually in this book, it's the bonus chapter at the end. We stole it from another textbook. Okay, one more thing, and then we'll actually open the book and get into the book. Let me see what time it is. I'll decide what to do. So, in psychology, people often distinguish between 3 different levels of analysis. The biological level of analysis, the psychological level of analysis, and the social level of analysis. So psychology is a very interdisciplinary field. We try to draw insights from neighboring fields. And to spell this out, I'll use depression again as an example. If you're interested in depression from a biological perspective, you would look at things like genetics, brain chemistry, etc. If you look at it from that perspective, you're using the biological level of analysis. If you're using the psychological level of analysis, you might ask things like, do depressed people have different thinking processes than non-depressed people? So for example, there's a lot of evidence that depressed people explain what happens to them in ways that are different from non-depressed people. When something good happens, they say, it's just chance, it really has nothing to do with me. And when something bad happens, they say it's all their fault. So when you talk about things like that, like what depressed people believe, you're using psychological vocabulary. If you try to explain depression or other disorders in terms of oppression or social experience, how people have treated them, obviously you're using the social level of analysis. There are nice examples of studies that try to use all 3. One of the kind of classic studies in psychology looked at differences between men in the northern United States and the southern United States. So the southern United States is more traditional, more religious, more old-fashioned, and they have more of what social psychologists call a culture of honor. This has many consequences, including the idea that if your honor or your kind of masculine pride is insulted, you are expected to retaliate, to kind of uphold your honor. In cultures of dignity, like the northern United States and Canada too, what you're expected to do is keep a stiff upper lip and not overreact or retaliate. So that's kind of the social dimension. These are cultural and social norms. So they brought in men from the southern United States and the northern United States. And when they were walking from one room to another, as part of the experiment, someone would walk by and bump into them and go, "Hey, watch where you're going, asshole." It seemed like it was real. It didn't seem like it was part of the experiment. And they measured their testosterone before and after. Men in the southern United States had an increase in testosterone. Men in the north did not. And this is not due to some racial difference. This is just the fact that growing up in these different cultural environments even changes how your biology reacts to these different situations. And at the psychological level, they were more likely to say that my, masculinity has been threatened if they were from the South. So that's a nice example of a study that, you don't have to remember the details of the study, but that's an example of a study that uses all of the levels. Okay, let's take a break here. I want to make sure we finish the chapter, so let's take 10 minutes. So come back at 4:45. Okay, let's get started again. And I just closed the doors because sometimes I'm loud and don't want to disturb the other instructors. I actually got in trouble once. My first gig teaching psychology was AP psychology. I don't know if any of you know AP psychology, but I taught it at an after-school program. And to explain classical conditioning, which we'll be talking about actually a little bit today, I brought this thing called Biter Be Goner from Amazon, which I had used on myself to get myself to stop biting my nails. It's this clear, odorless substance you put on your fingernails, and it tastes like shit. And using the principles of operant conditioning, it gets you to stop, or I guess classical conditioning. Although you could, I guess, technically construe it as either one. But in any case, it gets you to stop biting your nails. So I kind of showed it, and a bunch of guys in the class were like, ooh, I want to try it. So half the class wound up trying it, and they were like, oh, it's terrible, complaining. The other half was laughing at them. And this is a small building, so the staff came in and told me to regain control of my students. But anyway, so we'll now start chapter 1. Chapter 1 is about the history of psychology. Very zoomed out. We don't get into too much detail. And it starts actually with philosophy, with the philosophical roots of psychology. There's a reason for this. In the history of the various sciences, philosophy is like mom's house. It's where you start off. And then when a science grows up to be a big boy, he or she moves out and becomes its own field. So if you ask someone like Isaac Newton, are you a philosopher or a scientist? He would not have been able to answer. In those days, science was just called natural philosophy. One consequence of this, every professor here in the psych department, with maybe a few exceptions, has a PhD. Can anyone tell me what PhD stands for? It stands for Doctor of Philosophy. So every scientist technically has a degree in philosophy. If you want to make them mad, you can tell them that. Like, oh, philosophy, that's a bunch of nonsense. And this is certainly true of psychology. So many of the questions that we will ask started out as philosophical debates. Now I'm going to exercise some restraint when talking about these sections. As I say, I did my master's in philosophy. There's nothing more dangerous than someone with a philosophy background talking about philosophy, so I will keep it succinct. The first philosophical debate that the section talks about is the debate between dualism and materialism, sometimes called physicalism. Dualism is the view that there are two kinds of things, physical and non-physical, or material and immaterial, what have you. So, physical, atoms, molecules, those would all, and things made up of atoms and molecules, those would all be physical things. If you believe in God, presumably God would be a non-physical thing. And in the case of human beings, we have two aspects. We have a physical aspect and a non-physical aspect, if you are a dualist. We have our bodies, which includes our brain. But we also have a mind or soul, something that's separate from the body and, in the standard version, interacts with the body. So the mind is where our conscious experience is, and then it introduces effects into the body. So the most prominent defender of this view is René Descartes. Some people try to make Descartes out to be a dummy. Descartes was not a dummy. He invented Cartesian coordinates. It's like, the y-axis and the x-axis. He invented that. He was also a defender of mind-body dualism. Materialism, this doesn't mean materialism like being greedy. That's a different sense of the term. This means the belief that everything that exists is physical, including us. So the mind is not some separate invisible entity that interacts with the body. The mind, this is a very common phrase you'll hear in psychology and neuroscience, the mind is what the brain does. It's not some separate thing. We are just bodies with brains. So thinking, feeling, planning, all that stuff is just the brain and the body too doing stuff. Nothing over and above that. So as the book says, most psychologists today are materialists, or at least they act like materialists in the lab. Many psychologists, including one prominent one we'll talk about today, may have religious commitments of various kinds and be dualists on Sunday, so to speak. But when they're in the lab or when they're writing up a psychology paper, they won't say things like, the soul moves the atoms in the brain. They don't appeal to things like that. They appeal to mechanisms that can be understood materialistically. We'll see more about this when we talk about the brain, but there are reasons why materialism has come to be the dominant view. Everything that you care about related to psychology can be taken away by damaging parts of the brain. So things like the ability to feel different sorts of emotions, the ability to form memories, or to understand language, all of that can be taken away by damaging the brain. And it's kind of a strange view to say, well, if you destroy all of it, the mind still exists as this separate thing. It seems to be dependent entirely on the functioning of the brain, and to some extent other parts of the body. To spell this point out, I have a video from Sean Carroll talking about this. Okay, well said by Sean Carroll. Any questions about the difference between dualism and materialism? Okay, the next debate in philosophy that has some bearing on psychology is the debate between direct realism and indirect realism. Now, the book uses different terms for these ideas. The second position it calls idealism. If you go along with how the book defines idealism, and then you take a philosophy class, you will get into trouble. So we'll go with these terms, which I've put in the key terms list. And I'll keep it simple. If you're a direct realist, the brain or the mind is like a video camera. We get a direct picture of what the world is really like, or what reality is really like. We are directly acquainted with the way things are. If you are an indirect realist, the way that our sense organs and brain process information is more like an interpretation or a guess. The brain has to draw inferences, make guesses about the incomplete information coming in, and therefore often makes mistakes, even sometimes in basic sensory processing. Now, I was going to get really philosophical about this, but to make the point very directly, I'll just show a video. I guess I should say, psychologists are very much in the latter camp. We do not think we are directly acquainted with the way the world is. We think that all human cognition, including sensory experience, is fallible. And I'll show a video that will make this point very directly, which is a video showing the McGurk effect. All right, so I could get more philosophical about this, but for these terms, that should be sufficient. Any questions before I move on to the next set of philosophy terms? Okay, with the next set of philosophy terms, there's a crucial ambiguity that the textbook doesn't address. Because there's a term that's used in one sense in chapter 1, but a different sense in chapter 2. And it says one of them is good, but the other is bad. So to start off with, the debate in this chapter is the debate between empiricism and nativism. In this context, it's about the origin of ideas. Where do our ideas come from? Empiricists make the strong claim that all of our ideas come from experience or observation, things that we observe, things that happen to us. None of them are innate. So, in the context of ideas, they would take the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate, if you want to think about it like that. Nativism says some, not necessarily all, in fact, usually they don't say all, but some of our ideas are innate. We come pre-packaged with certain expectations, beliefs, or tendencies. Vis-a-vis this debate, psychologists typically, especially after the behaviorists, who we'll talk about later, take the nativist side. They believe that at least some of our psychological tendencies, beliefs, etc. are built in from the beginning. We'll see in actually the last chapter of this book various clever baby studies that have been done where you can do things like the following. You show babies two different scenes, one in which basic physical laws are violated and one in which they are not, and they seem more surprised by situations where basic physical laws are violated. Someone lets go of a ball and it goes up. Babies look longer. They're like, oh, that doesn't seem right. Seeming to show, at least it's consistent with the idea, that they have some basic physical expectations built in at the beginning. So in this context, according to kind of standard psychologists, this is good, bad, and this is good. There's a different sense of the term empiricism, which comes up in chapter 2. So in this context, it's about the origin of our ideas. Where do our ideas come from? And most psychologists don't think that all of our ideas come from experience. Some of them are innate. But there's a different sense of the term empiricism, which is about the justification of our ideas. Meaning, how do we know if our ideas are right? Whether they come from experience or not, how do we test whether the beliefs in question are true? In this latter sense of the term empiricism, the answer is you can only know if a belief is true or not by doing observations. So this is obviously how most scientists think about knowledge. You can't just sit down and think about whether it's true, you have to go and test it. In that sense, most psychologists are committed to empiricism. So this kind of empiricism is usually contrasted not with nativism, but with rationalism. Rationalism is the view that you can figure out that some things are true just by using rational thought, just by sitting in the armchair, closing your eyes, and thinking about stuff. Some people happened to be both. So for example, John Locke, very important philosopher, was an empiricist in both senses, but they are distinguishable. So this could be potentially confusing. Any questions about these terms? If you understand the difference, you're better off than the textbooks out there. Okay, so philosophers argued about subjects like this for, well, I guess thousands of years, going back to the ancient Greeks. We had the scientific revolution in the 1600s. People started to apply empirical methods to these kinds of questions, but psychology was kind of a late comer. You could argue about when exactly to date the beginning of psychology. The book mentions that there were various researchers who were really more physiologists or biologists who did some experiments that were relevant. So one example it gives is Helmholtz, who the book says in kind of a funny way, he would get people to sit down, close their eyes, and have people touch them in the leg, which sounds kind of creepy, but what they would do is measure how long it took for them from the moment of the touch to say that they were aware of it. And they would touch at different points. Helmholtz used this to estimate how fast nerve signals are transmitted. You can get actually a pretty good estimate just by doing that. So there were various things like that, including some good work on perception. But in the standard histories of psychology, the beginning of psychology is usually dated to the work of Wilhelm Wundt, German, in the late 1800s. Wundt was the first person to set up a lab specifically devoted to studying psychology. Wundt's approach, so for the rest of the chapter, we're going to see a number of different approaches in the early history of psychology. Wundt's is the first. And his perspective or paradigm is called structuralism. Wundt thought that psychology should model itself after chemistry. In chemistry, what you do is you take things and you break them down into their smallest component parts. You start by breaking it down into the chemical compound something is made of until you get all the way down to the table of elements, right? The basic building blocks of matter. Wundt thought we should do the same thing for conscious experience. So all of you are having conscious experiences right now. Maybe most of you, I may have lost some of you, but hopefully all of you are awake and having conscious experiences. And what Wundt thought we could do is break it down into what he called mental elements. So something like a particular shade of red, a particular kind of red experience, or a particular sound. Or in the context of emotion, he thought you could break emotions down into more basic things like level of positivity and negativity, or level of arousal. And if you do that, he thought you could have a complete science of the mind akin to chemistry. So one way to think about it, if you're a structuralist, you think that the right approach to studying the mind is to ask, what is it made of? What are the basic building blocks of our conscious mental life? Wundt used various techniques. One technique he used that was later criticized is introspection. I don't want to sell Wundt short. He did other sorts of experimental methods, including some that were similar to Helmholtz, but introspection means looking inward at your own mind. So he would train and he was a careful guy. He would train people to carefully observe their own mental states and report them. That was one method he used for collecting data. Okay, any questions on Wundt? So it's kind of a crash course. We're not going to look at any of these people in too much detail. You just need kind of the bird's eye view. The next gentleman was William James. William James wrote about pretty much everything. He was also a philosopher. He also wrote a lot about theology. He was kind of all over the place. James was, in his approach to psychology, was very strongly influenced by Charles Darwin. So James was in fact a precursor to a modern approach, which is evolutionary psychology. But it wasn't called that in those days. The name for his perspective is functionalism. While Wundt thought the right question to ask about the mind was, what is it made of? James thought the right question to ask is, what is it for? What is its function? If you think about things in an evolutionary way, you ask about different organs, why were they selected for by natural selection? So the heart is selected to pump blood, things like that. If an animal has a certain color of fur that makes it blend in with the environment, it was selected for as a kind of camouflage. So what is the mind or brain for? Well, for James, it's for guiding behavior in adaptive ways. He has a famous quote, thinking is for doing. Sometimes we think, oh yeah, we have these big fancy brains so we can sit down and think cool thoughts. But in fact, the brain is for guiding our behavior adaptively. There's a reason that trees don't have brains. They can't move. The brains wouldn't do them any good. No point in having brains if you can't move. So for James, that's what the mind is for. It's for guiding our behavior intelligently. So we'll come back to evolution and Darwin when we talk about evolutionary psychology. Okay, next, probably the single most famous psychologist in history, our good friend Sigmund Freud. How many of you have heard that? I think I asked earlier. Many of you have heard the name Freud. So Freud's single most important contribution is the notion that much of our thinking occurs unconsciously. In much of psychology, and actually philosophy before Freud, it was taken for granted that the conscious level is where all the action is. But Freud argued that no, much of our thinking occurs outside of our awareness. Now, in this course, I will have some fun at Freud's expense, but I will start by saying that was a very important insight. It was very important that it be argued that, in fact, much of our thinking occurs unconsciously. Virtually no one would dispute that today in psychology. Now, having said that, many of the details of Freud's theories are completely crazy, and virtually no one accepts them today. It's hard to know where to start, but as an example, Freud thought that all young boys were sexually attracted to their mother and were afraid that their father would cut their penis off. So, I will note, Freud had a great fondness for cocaine. The man did a lot of cocaine. So every once in a while I'm like, you know what, that's one of the cocaine ideas right there. So the technical term, by the way, for that is castration anxiety, and it shows up a lot in his theories. Okay, so talk about some other stuff related to Freud. Freud thought that the human personality was divided into three parts. The id, the ego, and the superego. In German, it's translated as ego and superego in English, but in German, it's literally just the it, the I, and the super I. That's all it is. So, I don't know why they translate it like this, but that's how we do it now. So the id is raw animal desire. So desire for food, for sex, or for dominance. The ego is the self. It's what kind of makes the decision. And the superego is your sense of right and wrong that your culture drums into you. So, just to pick a concrete example, you're married and you're working at an office and the attractive secretary is hitting on you and your id is like, yes, do it. And the superego says, oh no, that's morally wrong. And the ego has to kind of decide between these conflicting forces. Freud thought that there were various unacceptable urges or unacceptable pieces of information that we learn, and the ego has various strategies for dealing with these uncomfortable pieces of information. He called these defense mechanisms. And here, there's actually some evidence that some of these have something going for them. Actually, I guess we won't talk about this in this class, so here's one for free. There's one defense mechanism, that, and this isn't going to be on the test, but one defense mechanism called reaction formation, which is showing or reporting an emotion that's the opposite of the one you really feel. One of the funniest studies ever done, they got a bunch of guys into the lab and asked them how much they dislike gay people. And they hooked up, I'll put this in polite terms, a device that measured blood flow to a certain organ. And then they showed them gay porn. And the men who reported most strongly disliking gay men had the most blood flow during the gay porn. It's like, oh, that's terrible. So Freud would say, it's a kind of defense mechanism. Maybe I'll edit that part out. One that I think I do have listed in the key terms that's probably more well known is repression. So repression is kind of just pushing out of awareness different unacceptable thoughts or memories or what have you. I'll show a video of support for maybe another Freudian idea. There's a term that you'll see in the popular, you'll hear people say, which is Freudian slip. So a Freudian slip is where you accidentally say something that reveals maybe what you really think, at least in Freud's way of thinking about it. So you may have seen this happen, or maybe it happened to yourself, where you're trying to say one thing, but something you actually think comes out. I guess the way I should say it, if I'm being Freudian, is it's something bubbling up from the unconscious that makes its way out. So I have here a compilation of politicians engaging in Freudian slips, and fair game, there's people from the left and the right in this video. I'm not making any political point, but nice way to remember one of Freud's ideas. There's other ones, but if I show the other ones, my job will be at risk. Okay, a couple other things about Freud, and then we'll move on to the behaviorists. So, here's one way of thinking about Freud, kind of the pros and cons of Freud. Science, in the view of many philosophers of science, is basically a two-step process. I alluded to this earlier. Karl Popper, who's one of my favorites, argued that science is a process of conjecture and refutation. So, to make a conjecture is to make a guess, right? You make something up. And people often neglect the fact that that step requires creativity. You may not think of science as a creative process, but to make a hypothesis is to make a guess. You kind of have to be creative enough to make shit up. Stick your neck out, make a guess. Step two is where you get rationally rigorous. You try to disprove the theory. Try to think of, okay, if that guess that I made up was true, what would logically follow from that? And then try to test it with observation. And then if the guess survives your attempt to prove it wrong, you provisionally hold on to it, but subject it to further tests later. What I'll say about Freud is he was really good at step one. Very creative man, maybe in part due to the cocaine, but for whatever reason, he was very good at making up ideas, some of which were very insightful, but some of which were kind of crazy. He was perhaps not so good at rigorously testing them. And a related point that you'll often see made about Mr. Freud, or I guess Dr. Freud, is that many have charged that many of his ideas are unfalsifiable, to link it back to what I said earlier. That Freud's theory, at least the way he used it, had built-in mechanisms to protect it from falsification. So here's a simple example. Take the idea that young boys hate their father. Well, in practice, what Freudians would do is, no matter what the kid does, it's taken as evidence that he hates his father. If he hits his father, that's evidence that he hates his father. If he hugs his father, that's reaction formation. He's showing the opposite emotion of what he truly feels. If the boy ignores his father and plays with blocks and doesn't really care, or seems to not care, that's sublimation. He's taking his hatred for his father and redirecting it into playing with the blocks. Well, no matter what the kid does, it's evidence that Freud is right, and therefore it's not falsifiable. Okay, any questions on Freud? Okay, the next perspective, behaviorism, in many ways was a reaction against the views that we've seen so far. The behaviorists charged that the views we've seen so far were kind of too philosophical, too much mumbo-jumbo, arguing, especially Freud, but even the other views, like think of Wundt, right? Wundt's approach involved using introspection, looking into your own mind. Well, that seems kind of subjective and unscientific. And then Freud, there's all kinds of craziness. So the behaviorist said, we need to course correct. We need to stop theorizing of what the mind is, or what the mind is made of, or what have you, and stick to what we can directly observe. And what we can directly observe is what people do, how they behave. So the behaviorist said, let's stick to that. The behaviorists had three basic commitments. It's good to know these. The first one is only study behavior. Hence, behaviorist. Don't theorize about the mind. Be very strict. You can think of them as very strict empiricists, right? Only deal with what you can directly observe. Number two, the human mind is a blank slate. Blank slate meaning like a blank sheet of paper on which the environment writes. So they would take the nurture side of the nature-nurture debate. Genetic differences play no important role in how we think and behave. And number three, the way that the environment shapes us is through different types of conditioning. For the first one, there's a really bad joke that psychologists tell. Two behaviorists finish making love, and one says to the other, well, you enjoyed that. How was it for me? That's sort of the funny way to remember the first one. So only deal with behavior. Now, with regard to the last one, I'll spend some more time on that. So the behaviorists did a lot of work on animals and discovered patterns in how behavior can be changed through conditioning. The first type of conditioning is classical conditioning. And rather than get into all the technical terms, we'll deal with those in a later chapter. I'll just give a vivid example, which is in fact the first one. Ivan Pavlov, who was not a behaviorist, but his work provided part of the intellectual foundation for behaviorism. Have any of you heard the name Pavlov? Okay, yeah, so Pavlov did experiments with dogs, and what he found, and he actually basically found this by accident, but he found that if you have a repeated sound, let's say ringing a bell, you ring the bell, give the dog food. Next day, ring the bell, give the dog food. Initially, the dog salivates or drools just to the food, but with successive pairings, the dog would salivate or drool just to the bell. So that's a standard example of classical conditioning. If you pair two things together, you can get one of them to produce the response that normally the other one would. And as an example of this, I have a clip from The Office to make it memorable. Nice example there. So that's the first kind. And then John Watson, who was the founder of the school of behaviorism, took this idea and applied it to human beings. And he was the first to say, look, forget about the mind and stuff like that, just focus on behavior. The other behaviorist who really made it the dominant school in psychology, at least in the United States, was B.F. Skinner. Skinner introduced another type of conditioning, which is operant conditioning. For our purposes in Chapter 1, operant conditioning consists of reward and punishment. So, giving different types of rewards to increase the frequency of behavior and different sorts of punishments to decrease the frequency of behavior. And if you can't see, the term is operant conditioning. And it's listed in the key terms. So in the mid-20th century, up to, say, the 50s or so, behaviorism was the dominant school in psychology. For various reasons, some of which we'll get into when we talk about cognitive psychology, behaviorism fell out of favor. As with Freud, they're kind of a mixed bag. So these two processes, classical and operant conditioning, absolutely exist. Cognitive psychologists may explain the patterns somewhat differently, for example, in terms of expectations, but they absolutely discovered real patterns that are actually very useful to know about. But first of all, as I already mentioned, virtually no one in psychology thinks that humans are blank slates. We'll see several lines of evidence for genetics playing a role. And actually, I forgot to do something. So there's a famous quote from John Watson that I'm basically obligated to read. It's a very famous quote that really captures that second point, that the behaviorists believed in the idea of a blank slate. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities. So that's the blank slate in a nutshell. And now very few people in psychology accept that. Additionally, one objection that I would make, and I talk about this in more detail when I taught in a philosophy of science course at the U of A, is that the behaviorists were, in my judgment, wrong about philosophy of science. The behaviorist said that you should only deal with what's directly observable. But in the other sciences, it's common to posit unobservable entities, so long as those theoretical posits lead to predictions about things that you can observe. And here's a dead simple case. Physicists have theories about what goes on inside the sun, having to do with nuclear fusion and so on. And these are, well-established theories, and that's perfectly fine as long as those theories lead to predictions about things you can observe. So, and most psychologists today think that it's perfectly fine to theorize about how the mind works, as long as those theories lead to predictions that you can test. Okay, any questions about the behaviorists? So in a future chapter, we'll be talking about conditioning in a lot of detail, and basically the first half of that chapter is about the sorts of patterns that the behaviorists found. Okay, so next, we'll talk about a few sort of early precursors to something. So, as I mentioned, in the 50s and 60s, behaviorism fell out of favor, and a perspective called the cognitive perspective became the dominant one. But I'll talk about a few things that were sort of precursors to this. One is Gestalt psychology. This was around at the same time as the behaviorists, and it did try to uncover patterns in thinking, especially thinking as it relates to sensation, sensory experience. If you had to summarize the Gestalt perspective in one sentence, it would be the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Whole like WH, not just H. So here's a classic Gestalt stimulus. So how many of you see a triangle? So me too. We are all, hallucinating is not quite the right word, but there's no triangle. There's just three shapes with these chunks on the edges, right? And if you look at it, it may start to seem like, this is like a more bright white than what's outside, but there's no trickery, that is not there. There's no triangle. That's an example of how our perceptual systems work. We are pattern seeking. We try to find patterns even if some are not there. That's the kind of thing that Gestalt psychologists looked at. The next section also talks about developmental and social psychology. Don't worry about that for this chapter. We'll be talking about them, or at least one of them, in a later chapter. Developmental psychology just means studying how humans change over time, like from childhood up to old age. And social psychology, which I cover in 1200, is about the psychology of human social interaction. One perspective I will talk about because it really is a different perspective, not just a different area of study, is humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology is one school that rebelled both against behaviorism and against a Freudian approach. Humanistic psychology doesn't like viewing humans as sort of machines that are determined by scientific laws. They really didn't like the idea of determinism, which both Freud and Skinner believed in. Determinism is the idea that everything that happens is determined by prior causes. So it's a common view among those with kind of a scientific picture of the world that it's all just the clockwork of cause and effect. It is taken by some people to rule out free will. That if it's all just physical law working itself out, some people argue that rules out the idea that we have free will. And the humanists didn't like this. They said, yes, no, we do have free will. We can self-actualize and are not constrained by the clockwork of scientific law.
You said everything that happens is determined by what?
By prior causes. That's determined. That's a view that the humanistic psychologists rejected. If you want to remember why they're called humanistic, and this isn't quite where the term comes from, but they had a very positive vision of human nature, that we are free to determine our own destiny, and when they would treat people, they would try to encourage them to achieve their inner unique potential. That's the approach that they took. So even though those perspectives existed to some extent at the same time as behaviorism, behaviorism remained dominant until the 50s and 60s, at which point there was an event called the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution led to a renewed emphasis on thinking, on psychological processes. Several things led to this. One important reason this revolution happened was computers. So one important fact about computers is you can know a lot about how they function and principles related to how they function without knowing all that much about the physiology. So you could learn coding or even simple things like how to use Microsoft Word without knowing how the transistors work. What you're learning about are higher level patterns in how the computer behaves. And you don't actually need to know how it works at that fine-grained level of analysis. And what the cognitive people said is, the brain, you could think of it as a kind of information processor. It's kind of like a computer. And without knowing exactly what the neurons are doing, you can uncover patterns in how memory works, how belief formation works, or what have you. So that was one important precursor to it. And the kinds of mental processes that cognitive psychologists study are the kinds that it's easy to imagine a computer doing, the kind of information processing types of thinking. Memory, language use, belief formation, that kind of thing. So we don't cover this much in this class, but if you take 1200, you'll see that cognitive therapists, what they do is challenge beliefs and the ways that you process information. So if someone is depressed, a cognitive therapist will say that you're probably thinking about the world in an irrational way, and you should learn to challenge that. That's probably enough detail for here. Any questions on the cognitive perspective? Okay, next, two related perspectives that are relevant to the nature-nurture debate. These are two different approaches, specifically that are about the genetic underpinnings of different forms of thinking and behavior. But there's a very important difference between them. So the two I'm referring to are behavior genetics and evolutionary psychology. So there's an entire chapter on this that we'll be covering later in the course. The chapter covers both of them. Here's the crucial difference. Behavior genetics is about the ways that we are different as humans. Evolutionary psychology is primarily about ways in which we are the same. In other words, it's primarily about human universals and how these human traits evolve. So I won't go into too much detail on either right now, but for behavior genetics, I'll start by just talking about one of the key methods that we'll see in a later chapter, which is different sorts of twin studies. How many of you have heard of twin studies? A handful, so actually a decent number. So probably the most famous and the easiest to understand is studies of identical twins raised apart. So there are cases where identical twins are raised in separate families. And what you can do is look at the similarity of those twins for any trait that you care about. So calculate how strongly correlated they are for any trait that you can measure. And what you find is, for virtually any trait that you can measure, they are substantially similar. Not 100%, but there's virtually no trait in psychology where the correlation is 0. Typically, around 50% of the variance in any trait you measure is explainable by genes if you use the estimates derived from these kinds of twin studies. So there's some caveats to add to that, but we'll see that in more detail in a later chapter. I'll just mention, there's a different method that uses twins where you don't look at adoption, you look at twins raised in the same home, but you look at the similarity of identical twins raised in the same home and the similarity of non-identical twins. If genes influence a trait, the identical twins should have a larger correlation for the trait in question. So here you can get bigger samples, because there's not that many twins that are adopted into separate families. If that second method gives you a headache, don't worry about it. We'll look at it in more detail in a later chapter. Okay. For evolutionary psychology, I'll start by explaining a very important term. This will probably be a review for most of you, but anyways, and that's natural selection. So I'll say up front, evolutionary psychology is a very controversial approach for several reasons. One obvious reason is many religious people object to evolution on religious grounds. But actually, many people who are on the, if you like, secular left, object to evolutionary psychology on other grounds. For example, evolutionary psychologists typically argue that many sex differences are biologically based, and some people object to that. And there are also scientific issues that you could raise. I'll just say up front, this is not a course to get you to believe things. You can believe whatever you want. You can disagree with the different perspectives that we will talk about. All you're required to do is understand the different perspectives. So, what is natural selection? Natural selection, when you boil it down, is actually pretty simple. You just need a few basic ingredients. You need some kind of mechanism of inheritance. You need traits that can be passed on. You need variation. So you need these traits to be different. So in the context of biological evolution, the mechanism of inheritance is DNA. That's what allows traits to be passed on. And variation is introduced through random mutation. So genes are pretty damn good at getting themselves accurately copied, but DNA copying is not perfect. Sometimes random changes emerge. Whatever, something happens, you get a new gene. Most of those changes are either irrelevant or negative. But by chance, some of them will be suited to the environment. Which leads to the third ingredient, which is you need differential success in reproduction. In other words, some traits are better at getting themselves passed on than others. There are differences in how reproductively successful different organisms are. So here's a dead simple case. Let's say you have a bear with black fur, and it migrates to the Arctic. It has 2 cubs. One of them gets the black fur gene. The other gets the white fur gene, so the other one is a mutant, right? It has a random change in its DNA. Now, this shouldn't happen all the time. In order for evolution to work, DNA copying has to be pretty good, but every once in a while, by chance, you'll get an error. Because the bear happens to be in the Arctic, the bear with the white fur gene will live longer. You know, the prey can't see it coming, so it gets to eat more food, and then it has more time to have fun with the female bears and has more babies. Generation after generation, this continues. Eventually, all the bears in that area will have the white fur gene. That's really it. That's natural selection. It doesn't require any intervention. It's just genes, but I guess I should give a definition. Natural selection is the thesis that genes which are more suited to the environment increase in frequency over time. That's it. Genes which are more suited to the environment increase in frequency over time. So in this case, the white fur gene is more suited to the snowy environment, and so over time it increases in frequency. It becomes more common in that environment. So as I said, actually, first of all, any questions about natural selection before I talk about the connection with psychology? So evolutionary psychology works with the assumption that our brains are the product of evolution by natural selection. We are evolved animals. Which is nice to remember, by the way. Darwin has a nice line that we bear the stamp of our lowly origin. Nice to remember that. You know, if you screw up, just remember you're only a half chromosome different from a chimpanzee. Failure's not all that surprising. If you do something well, just be amazed by that. Just be, wow, I didn't fail. This is amazing. Just a hairless bipedal chip, but I managed to do it. Where was I going with this? So they work with the assumption that the brain is an evolved organ, and that many of our psychological tendencies can be explained through reference to natural selection. So here's a simple example. Why is sugar tasty? And you might think, well, it's just naturally tasty. Why would you need to ask that? But things aren't tasty in and of themselves. Taste is in the eye, or I guess the tongue, in the tongue of the beholder. You know, some insects think that poop tastes good. It's not like we're right and they're wrong what poop tastes like. It just depends on how you react to it. So we evolved in Africa in a context where food was scarce, and preferences, so sugar is high energy for us, right? Glucose is high in energy, and any genes which bias you towards high energy food, if you're in a food scarce context, those genes will increase in frequency over time because they're more adaptive. So our ancestors who had the preference for sugar had more babies than those who didn't. That's the explanation evolutionary psychologists would give. Evolutionary psychologists try to explain different mating, sexual preferences in terms of natural selection. So one preference that exists both in humans and in other species, all the way down to insects, is a preference for bilateral symmetry. Insects prefer to mate with other insects that are symmetrical. Why is that? It's basically a cue of genetic health. When you mate with someone, you are sharing your genes with them. Your descendants will have half the genes from you and half from your partner. And so there's a built-in preference for cues to genetic health. And one simple one is bilateral symmetry. So that one goes very deep in our evolutionary past. One funny one that makes the point is, why aren't young men super attracted to elderly ladies sexually? One simple way of putting it, any guy who had genes that made him really into old ladies, he did not spread his genes. Those genes did not get passed on. So that should give you a sense of how evolutionary psychologists think about questions like this. So we'll talk about this in more detail. One issue I'll just flag that will come up, critics of evolutionary psychology sometimes say, well, these are nice stories, but how do you test them? Do these lead to testable predictions? We'll talk about that issue when we come to the chapter on it. Any questions on evolutionary psychology? Okay, next there's a section on neuroscience. I don't have too much to add to this, so it's kind of self-explanatory. So this is the study of how brain processes undergird psychological processes. Again, there's an entire chapter here, so we'll learn about different methods for studying how events in the brain are causally implicated in how we think and behave. Okay, and then the last type of psychology we'll talk about is cultural psychology. So this is obviously the study of how culture affects how we think and behave. And we'll do a little in-class activity for this. This is a real psychology task, although I'll make it shorter than it would be if you were doing it for real. On your computer or on a piece of paper, I want you to do the following. I want you to write down as many statements as you can. I'll give you a few minutes. So I want these to all be true statements that begin with the words I am. So as many true, and I won't ask you to share them, but as many true statements as you can that begin with the words I am. Okay, show of hands now. How many have at least 7? Okay, we'll stop there. So here's what I want you to do. Look through the statements and put them into 2 buckets. Kind of count up how many are in each bucket. The first bucket is relational statements, meaning statements that have to do with your relationship to other people. So I am a son, I am an employee, I am a sister, I am a friend. Any of those in the relational bucket. All others, non-relational. So just count up how many are in each bucket. Okay, show of hands, how many have more in the relational bucket? Oh wow, usually I have big classes, maybe there's more than that. So I assume you all have more in the bucket. Show of hands, how many have more in the non-relational bucket? Yeah. Anyone have a tie? No? One was close to a tie. Okay, interesting. So this is a real test. Although it's not always done in terms of you have more of one or less. But if you look at the raw scores of how many in each bucket you get, people in Western countries are more likely to have more in the second bucket, whereas people in non-Western countries are more likely to have more in the relational bucket, at least compared to how many people in Western countries give. This relates to probably the most important distinction in cultural psychology, which is the distinction between individualistic cultures and collectivistic cultures. Individualistic cultures think that, or people in those cultures think that what matters is individual uniqueness. So achieving your unique potential, even if it means kind of going outside of the norms and expectations of your culture. People in collectivistic cultures think that what matters is abiding by the expectations of your family, your community, etc. And relatedly, people in collectivistic cultures are more likely to think of themselves as relationally embedded. So when you're asked to think about yourself, you're more likely to mention that you're a son, a brother, or what have you, relative to people in individualistic cultures. So the most individualistic culture in the world is the United States by many measures, and places like Canada, Western Europe, etc. are high on different measures of individualism. Cultures like South Asian, East Asian cultures are more collectivistic. Places like Latin America or Eastern Europe may be somewhere in the middle. So you talk about that more in 1200, but that's an example of the kind of thing that a cultural psychologist would study. And with 18 minutes to spare, that's all I have. Any questions about anything I've said? Okay, see you all next week. We'll talk about research methods.